Right, so we're going with Moism, which is Chinese religion, or philosophy really, it's more a philosophy in China, associated with Mo Tzu, who was an important philosopher, living around about 400 BC. He lived from 479 to 438 BC, so nearly 500 years before Christ. He was a learned man, a sage. He wrote the Book of Mo Tzu. He believed in the gods, he believed in the Tao. He was a sort of Taoist, you know. He believed in Shen, which is their name for spirit, and Shangdi, which is the king of heaven, the sort of god. Also Niu Shen. Important philosopher because he made a kind of intellectual breakthrough, which was very similar to Christ. He said that human beings should have this agapic, unconditional regard for each other. It's translated as love, but I think that word needs refining if we're going to talk about Mo Tzu's philosophy. He called it universal love, which is ai. The spirits and the demons exist, and they're out and will punish us if we fail to live by cosmic law. So if we secretly go and kill our neighbour, they can see us. And if we fail to live by the laws of love and start persecuting each other and, you know, locking each other in prison and torturing each other, the spirits and demons will get us in the end. So he believed in peace then naturally follows. Not the kind of absolute pacifism and non-violence of Jainism, but a moderate, rational kind of non-violence. So he would be very against what China's done in invading Tibet. When Chinese troops invaded in 1959, they launched full-out attacks to conquer this amazing landscape. And they used like modern weapons, tanks, planes, machine guns against poor old Tibetans who were on horseback with just like, you know, single firing guns if they were lucky. Otherwise it was swords. And they just massacred them all. And then I've read this really tragic book called Tibet, O Tibet, when these are Maoist communist cadres that invaded Tibet, claiming to be the civilized people. But actually they were brutal in their suppression of Tibetan culture and tortured the monks, and also did what's called ritual cannibalism. In the book by an English scholar who went out there and studied all this, he discovered that these Tibetan people, after they'd put up a resistance, you know, tried to fight off tanks with a few muskets, then the communist chief would come and they'd organise a banquet in which they'd kill and eat the chief headman of the village. Ritually, like, you have his liver, you have his lungs, you know. And this was done in front of the assembled village to show who was the new master. Don't you dare think of rebelling against us. We're the Chinese. We'll literally eat you if you do that. And scholars have studied that. I was absolutely shocked when I read this. I thought, what? 20th century? Could this be true? Yeah, it's been documented and proved that this was done in the 1950s and 60s. It's called political cannibalism. It's like you do it to make the point, you know. Blimey. So Mo Tzu would be absolutely, utterly opposed to that. You know, that's completely no-no. And the spirits and demons are going to get the guys that did that. He loved pacifism and peace, like a Christian. So really, he's like a pre-incarnation of Christ, maybe, for all we know. He didn't like ritualism. He thought that, you know, quite how you pray and what incense you burn and what time of day you do it, that's less important than being with the love. He's like a Californian hippie in that sense. And I agree with him. The values we should live by, therefore, this universal love, but also harmony, which guarantees that everybody can do their thing in their own way, at their own time, in a kind of invisible harmony of the spheres, that there's no competition between. You know, you can be a Basque down there doing your thing, worshipping your, you know, spirits of the air, making love and causing thunder and lightning, that's fine. You can be a Jain over there doing your thing. but let harmony prevail, was his point. And benevolence, therefore, becomes the key ethic we should pursue. Kindness to people, compassion. In many ways, quite similar to what Buddha was saying, except Buddha was making a big fuss about there being no self, and Motsu wouldn't agree with that. You know, there's a temporary self at least, so let's respect each other's selves. It's part of why we all have human rights. If you say no self, then you can say, well, I'll kill you because it doesn't matter, you haven't got a self, so why don't we just get into chopping up and eating cannibals style. And actually, Mao Zedong was what I call an insane Buddhist, because he was brought up a Buddhist, and he took that literally, that there's no self, therefore nothing matters, and therefore we can just do what we want and create a new, Chinese civilization which ignores the wisdom of the past. So Motsu wasn't allowed to be taught for centuries, for decades in extreme communist China. I'm sure there are philosophers now studying it, but in the day you had to just read Mao Zedong during the Cultural Revolution. So they clamped down on thinkers like Confucius and Lao Tzu and Motsu to their detriment. Where you learn about the crazy, extreme Buddhism of Mao Zedong is in a detailed biography of his early years, where people have looked at his student essays. He preached a kind of total nihilism. There are no ethics, there's no values, there's no God, there's not even a self. Therefore there's just ego, actually, which is the paradox. If you turn Buddhism inside out, you get total egotism. And he set out to use brigandage and slaughter to win. But so Motsu was against all that, and obviously in Taiwan and places where the Chinese community can breathe freely, there's more respect paid to these ancient Chinese sages. So anyway, well done, Motsu, we love you. And what was the other one?
Bon.
Oh, right. Okay. Yes, so the Bon religion I find fascinating. This is the primal religion of Tibet. And that's why I was talking about the sufferings of the Tibetan people after the Chinese invaded. The Bon religion was a kind of proto-Buddhism religion. It was their pagan or druid kind of faith. They believed in nature spirits like Motsu did. And they lived up, obviously, in the high Himalayas and the roof of the world. They thought of their deities as spirit beings up in the clouds, looking down on humanity. There were male and female Bon deities, and we know the names of quite a few of them. One of my favourite is called Pihar, and his consort. He was famous for being the resident deity of Mount Kailash, which is the centre of the universe, or the centre of the world. Hindus call it Mount Meru, and they say Indra lives there. Well, the Buddhists were there first, the Bon were there even before them, and say, no, that's where Pehar lives. And he was thought of as flying around in the air with his consort. And I put him in my Tarot of the Gods book. I have Pihar as a card in the Tarot of the Gods, and I gave all the details about his life and his teachings. The word Bon means invokers. So these are people that invoke the gods for protection and guidance. So you go into deep prayer, meditation, and you invoke these different deities. We know the names of some of their sages: Tonpa Shenrab Miwash, Dranpa Namka, 8th century AD, Blolden Sninpo, 1360 to 1385. I love these names, right?
Yeah.
And they lived in temples way up in the mountains, full of bright colours. Bon art and colour was very important. There's an oral tradition of the sages going back to the 14th century and way before, called Xibrij. And we have Shenrab's biography, which he was one of their great teachers. And there are Bon tantras that teach like the secrets of the body, what is sexuality, how you can access that energy. they were strongly influenced by the Buddhists, and so there's been like a fusion between Bon and Buddhist teachings in Tibet. When the great tantric teacher Padmasambhava came to Tibet, he was asked by the king to come and teach Buddhism. And he, like a sensible chap, sensible Buddhist, he wanted to make a peace treaty with the local deities. Because Buddhism in tantric teachings doesn't, disbelieve in deities. They're real, they exist. But it just says they're not eternal. Like, they're not going to last forever and ever and ever. They themselves have their own life cycles. And therefore, the metaphysics of Buddhist teachings about impermanence applies to them also. So, when Padmasambhava taught that, the gods used to come and listen. That's why it was said when Buddha was teaching, the gods would come. So in his classroom there'd be, lots of deities invisible to the eye listening in. So Padmasambhava wisely did a peace deal, and he went and met the top Bon people. And they had a kind of contest of magical powers. They had the trick was you had to be at the bottom of the mountain and fly up to the top in the quickest time. And Padmasambhava, being a really crafty tantric guy, could always get to the top first. And much as the Bon tried, they couldn't beat him. So they made a peace treaty, and Padmasambhava got the Bon god, Pihar, to swear to protect the Dharma instead of opposing it. Which was a very clever move, because Pihar, being a wisdom deity, he wasn't opposed to Buddhism. He was opposed to crazy Mao Zedong type nihilistic Buddhism, which is disrespectful to the gods. Padmasambhava didn't teach that. He taught holistic, integral Buddhism, if you want, which is respectful of the indigenous deities of the whole planet, wants to work with them and reach a collective enlightenment for everybody, male and female, whether you've got clothes on or not. Tantra is the most profound of these teachings. And so Pihar said, okay, I'll be a protector of that Dharma. And so the Bon have respected the Buddhists and they civilized them in a sense by teaching them this breadth of view. So they're coming into Tibet saying, Buddhism's the best, all become Buddhists, shave your head and become a monk and there's no soul. And these Bon masters would say, yeah, hello, welcome. Welcome to the land of, the clouds. You'll learn. Just, sit on your cushion for a few years and you'll get wise. And that conversation's been going on ever since. And there are Bon monasteries, there's people in exile because they had to flee when the Tibetans were attacked by China because the Chinese troops were trying to eat them. So they left and they escaped to Taiwan or America. There's Bon monasteries also in the southern Himalayas, like in Nepal and places. How do you reach enlightenment, according to the Bon tradition? Well, there are 9 ways. Seership, which means cultivating your druid seership, your faculty of prophecy, as in all the prophetic traditions. Conquering negative energies, including negative emotions, that feeling of, I can't be bothered, life's horrible, it's all depressing. No, you've got to conquer that. So you cut through that with the diamond blade. You transmute illusions. So if, illusions are annoying you, you just conquer them by transmuting them into some, what's the wisdom of that thing? What am I supposed to learn from that enemy that keeps attacking me on Facebook or whatever? What's the teaching there? And once you've conquered that, you transmute it. You follow what is truly existing, the path of ontology, what is real. The way of virtue, and a practice of the 10 virtues and the 10 perfections. So this is things like truth and kindness, all ethical path, right? You have to do a time of great asceticism, so you have to prove you can survive on 1 grain of rice a day for a year or so, and just conquer your craving for your bodily comforts, and prove that you're willing to sacrifice all that stuff. I did that back in my 20s, so I don't have to do that yet. And you learn the basic of pure tantric sound. So this is what I've tried to put in my Kabbalah runes. The Bon are masters of the sonic mysticism of the primal sounds of existence. So you listen to the birds, you listen to the waves. It's all one sound vibrating, which we can replicate in our speech. And they're magical. And you have to study that. You follow the way of sacred relationship, so it's good to have a consort, find somebody to love and trust and honour and work together. There's, mastering enlightenment is difficult enough alone, but it's sometimes easier with a consort. But make sure you find the right one and sign up a wisdom affair. And then finally, the supreme way of release into absolute truth and great perfection. That sort of happens, to a great sage, maybe around the time of death. It happened to Buddha, happened to Christ's ascension. Great sages, when they die, they kind of leave a trail of light behind them. So those are just some of the ideas of the Bon religion, which I think should be studied more. That's why I think this periodic table should be on every classroom wall. There's only about a few 100,000 left. But long may they flourish, and this is why I envision and want to see a Tibet that's free of colonialism, because really the Chinese have colonized Tibet. And it's, everyone's against colonialism in the UN and so on, but we kind of overlook Tibet, that it's been colonialized. As if Chinese colonialism is fine, but British wasn't. No, let's not have double standards. So the Bon people are also fighting for their independence in Tibet. It's not like the Chinese have to leave, it's just that they need to let the Tibetans make the running in how they want to live in their world, which seems fair, doesn't it? So, so that's that. So I think there's a lot of, if tomorrow the Chinese Communist Party said, we've done our homework, we've listened to Daffern's Philosophy Club, and we've decided we're going to promote Mo Tzu as the top thinker of Chinese culture, and we're going to demote Mao Zedong. We've realised he was a crazy guy, teaching an insane form of Buddhism, and we're going to demote him. So Mo Tzu's the guy from now on. We're going to preach universal love. Now, if the Chinese Communist Party adopted the Mo Tzu philosophy, they would immediately be able to make peace with Tibet. They'd say, sorry, we're tearing up Maoist stuff, with no more political cannibalism. You follow your way, we love you, Tibetans. And they'd be very happy they can make a peace treaty between the hardcore Bon pose and the Mo Tzu followers tomorrow. And China and Tibet would live happily ever after. Dalai Lama can go back to the Potala Palace. Chinese soldiers won't be needed, they can go home and become farmers. And we can collectively work on stopping climate change and all the real problems the world's facing. And by the way, no war with America. The Mo Tzus would say, no, we're not, we're going to do a Gorbachev and just disarm. We don't want a nuclear war with America, we'll sign peace treaties instead. Because America's crazy enough, and we don't want to see them being crazy and dropping missiles on Beijing. It's too precious. So, there we are. Mo Tzu and the Bon would get on well, I think.
Yeah.
Excellent. One more. Let's do one more.
Okay. Wahhabism. Have we done that? Islam?
No.
86?
Yeah, we can do that.
Super.
Mm.
And next to that... New religions move. 102. Santo Daime.
Okay. This should be interesting. Yeah. Okay, so we'll start with Wahhabism, number 86. So, this is a form of Islam that arose in the Arabian Peninsula, what is now called Saudi Arabia. And it was very involved with the birth of Saudi Arabia, in fact. it's thought there are about 75 million followers of it at the moment. It was associated with this chap, Ibn Wahhab, who was the founder of it, who was a particular imam, particular spiritual teacher of Islam. Ibn Abd al-Wahhab, he was called. And he had a, forgive me for saying this, a somewhat limited view of Islam. He'd studied the core disciplinary texts of law and theology, but he hadn't dared look outside that box. He'd not looked into philosophy or spirituality or Sufism. He was very, very strict, and he was very puritanical in his own personal views. Having a limited view of Islam, he believed in the most conservative or retrograde kind of interpretation of Islam that accumulated. Everything that is worshipped apart from Allah is false. So if Ibn Wahhab and his army captured the Basque region, they would kill off all the Basque spiritual sages, because they're all worshipping idols and devils, and they all have to worship Allah in exactly the same way, do their prayer mat 5 times a day, how they dress, what they wear, they can't have a mustache, but they have to have a beard, all these little details, which were really just cultural accumulations, became for them a sort of a thing of fanatical self-identification. If you're looking different, then you're not with us, so we'll... And he was quite violent, old Ibn Wahhab. He interpreted literally some of the more strict ideas of Islamic law that were around at that time. In the early 18th century, he was living around those times. His sort of code was set up around about 1780 AD. But he took very literally some of the sort of religious ideas that, for instance, adultery, there was no mercy for that. If your girlfriend was caught with another lover, or and you weren't married, no sex outside marriage, that was the death penalty. And if your sister or something went and fell in love with a baker and had a little affair, and you caught them, then she would be stoned to death for adultery. That was the mandatory rule. There was no compassion possible. There was no but I really love him, I want to get married, I'm pregnant. No, stoning. And so much so that some people questioned him and said, isn't this a bit harsh? That's my sister there. And he would say, no, it's God's way. And he himself would lead the stoning. He would get up there and throw the first stone if people were wavering. Well, I think that's barbarous and very unfortunate, and it has given a very bad press to Islam, because sadly this Wahhabism, as it's called, should have died a death as a little minor sect that nobody really bothered with, kind of like an Appalachian kind of backward form of Christianity that lives up in the Shenandoah Upper Valley, but nobody takes it seriously. Unfortunately, Ibn Wahhab became a friend of the founder of the Saudi Arabian kingdom, who was a warrior, Ibn Saud, Muhammad ibn Saud, who was like the sword arm. And Ibn Wahhab became his mentor and teacher. And wherever Muhammad ibn Saud conquered, and he was a ferocious fighter on his camel army and his horseback, and they just had the beginnings of guns and stuff, he managed to carve out this kingdom in central Arabia, which the Turks weren't able to suppress this revolt. It was a rebellion against the Turkish Ottoman, which was a much more civilized kind of Islam, much more Sufistic, and much more intellectual, and more open to currents of enlightenment from the West. The Wahhabis hated all that stuff. They said it was all devil worship, and they would shoot you, So, and unfortunately that became the dominant creed of the Saudi Arabian kingdom. Well, now that might have been not a problem, because hey, it's in the middle of nowhere, it's in the desert. Except that the Saudis discovered oil in the 1920s and became one of the richest kingdoms on the planet. And, therefore they were able to spread this form of Islam to lots of mosques around the Middle East, where they would say, we want you to convert to Wahhabism. Stop teaching Sufism, stop teaching philosophy, stop teaching anything to do with comparative religion. Burn that periodic table for a start, you know. It's only Ibn Wahhab's form of Islam that is true. All the other things are like heretics and devil worshippers. And here's a couple of million quid, you know, to pay for the textbooks that we'll give you and the lecturers that will teach this stuff. And so these Wahhabis took over, or tried to take over, all the kind of major intellectual centres of the Islamic world during the second part of the 20th century. And it was them that inspired the really hardcore, violent jihadists. So the people that, you know, think nothing of blowing up a nightclub and killing everyone, or shooting people, or beheading them, or whatever. They're all inspired by Ibn Wahhab's vision, which is no compromise with the West. It's all pagan devil worshippers. And sadly, that became the dominant creed of the Saudi Arabian government. Now, it was a mistake. I mean, you know, I wish the goddess and I could invent a time capsule and go back and change this, but the British encouraged this without knowing what they were doing, because in World War I, we sided with these Arabians against the Turkish Ottomans, and we successfully brought down the Ottoman Empire, and elevated the Arab dynasties of Saudi Arabia into becoming regionally important powers. And you know, it's never really been undone, the chaos that was caused by that. Fast forward to the attitude of, you know, the current Saudi crown prince, who is a, you know, typical sort of devotee of violence. I mean, he had this journalist, Khashoggi, who was saying, Saudis, come on, get real, have a bit more liberalism, let women drive, for God's sake, because women weren't allowed to drive. Let's teach Daffern's periodic table in the schools, because at the moment even philosophy can't be taught in Saudi schools, right? You just get the Wahhab thing. And for that, he was arrested and cut into pieces in the Turkish embassy of the Saudis in Istanbul and buried in a secret location by the orders of the crown prince, who is there shaking hands with Putin. You know, this is evil. This is where ethics and why philosophy is so important, because contra that kind of fanaticism, I would say no, tolerance, proper education, proper philosophy is the antidote. I'd be happy to give a lecture to the Wahhabi College of Imams anytime, because I used to lecture at the Muslim College, and that's why I did my commentary on the Quran. I would invite the Wahhabi College of Imam training to listen to my commentary on the Quran. It's only 200 hours. Translate it into Arabic. Go through it and tell me if I'm right or wrong. Go through it and listen. And, you know, I believe that my commentary on the Quran is actually authentic Islam, what it's supposed to be about. I think Muhammad is on my side in this quarrel, and I think Ibn Wahhab was a foolish, ill-educated person who has caused a lot of trouble and harm to Islam. You know, if we do a thought experiment, and instead of Ibn Wahhab becoming so important, let's say it was a great Sufi or sage or philosopher became the leader of the Saudis, we'd have a totally different world. We would have never had a 9/11, we wouldn't have had you know, all the terrorism and violence and beheadings and stuff. When I first moved here to France, you know, occasional random Muslims would go and just stab people in swimming pools or on the beach in France because they weren't dressed properly, and they thought it was their idea of, you know, doing God's will to just stab them to death. Well, none of that would happen without the Wahhabis. Because I think authentic Islam and true philosophical ideas at the core of that are not in favour of that kind of violence. They're more on the, they'd be more with the Basque wisdom teachers and the more moderate of the Jains, believing in non-violence. So that's the Wahhabis. And, okay, what's the next one?
New religious movement
Of?
was, I have to find it back.
The Santo Daime?
Yes.
What number is that again?
102.
102, okay. Yes. Right. Well, this is interesting. So it's from Brazil, Santo Daime, which is a fascinating melting pot of cultures. Brazil. I've been reading about it recently. I'm reading the journey of Charles Darwin around the world, the voyage of the Beagle, and he goes to Brazil when it wasn't, very urbanized, and he's trotting around looking at all the animals and studying the rocks and things. It's quite a good book, The Voyage of the Beagle. So this was founded, it's a kind of new religious movement, founded in the 1930s by a chap called Raimundo Ireneo Serra. Mestre Ireneo, he's called. It integrates forms of Christianity, particularly Catholic, so it loves a good, ritual and so on. It believes that the religion behind the religions will never die. There's a common universal religion. The spirit is eternal. Through prayer and meditation we can contact that spirit. Study is important. And interestingly, they incorporated into their more Christian rituals the use of ayahuasca, which is a psychedelic medicine that creates great vision and takes people to places of higher consciousness. The ego completely dissolves and you have an out-of-body experience of great imaginal power, and you meet these beings, these out-of-body sort of spirits and demons, if you want. But they don't do you any harm. They just shock you into thinking, God, I'm not alone. There are other beings. And Graham Hancock has written a great book called Supernatural, which is about his experiences with ayahuasca, how he saw these beings in trance. And he reckons that all the ancestral art of ancient South Africa and possibly even parts of the Lascaux people were doing these psychedelics and were exploring altered states of consciousness. And that was the birth of art. Well, that's why they're doing it in the Santo Daime tradition. It was also strongly influenced by the spiritualism of Brazil and a French sage called Allan Kardec. Allan Kardec was a spiritualist in 19th century France. He was a mathematician and a teacher. And he initially was quite skeptical of supernatural stuff. But he met mediums and they were able to convince him that they were in touch with spirits from beyond the grave. Told him personal stuff about his life that no one could know. And he then studied scientifically the whole medium phenomena. He got really qualified people and he wrote books about it. And he founded French spiritualism, essentially, from Paris. He was a Freemason as well, because it gave a sort of solidarity to people who were thinking outside the box. And his ideas spread to Brazil and Spain. The rear guard of the Catholic Church didn't like Allan Kardec. They said, oh, heresy, and tried to confiscate his books. But, they got through, and a lot of people in Portugal and Spain became convinced by Allan Kardec's research. What's interesting is that he himself was told by Spirit he was the reincarnation of an ancient Druid. So he's in my Encyclopedia of Druid Studies, 2nd edition. And so these people, the Santo Daime people, they believe the spiritualism of Brazil. And, if you can't afford to go to a medium or can't be bothered, you can take the ayahuasca and see for yourself, is their view. But it's done in a very sacramental way. They integrate also South American shamanism generally, because the indigenous people of South America knew all about their spiritualism and the spirit beings. What's important? What are the values and virtues for Santo Daime? Well, love, personal friendship, respect for all spiritual teachings, love and reverence